What's up guys, my name is Splice Knight, welcome back to another episode of Reflections, and today we're going to be talking about something kind of awesome, nihilist culture.
That's the thing. I don't think I believe in deep down. I kind of think all you are is just the things that you do.
What is it about society that disappoints you so much?
Now, if you guys have watched any of my previous reflections, you'll know that I talk way too much about nihilism. Now, there is a reason. The reason that I do this actually has a lot to do with the cultural norms that we're currently dealing with. And now, that has a lot, obviously, to do with who's in power and that sort of thing, but it also has a lot to do with the influences of the media, the opinions that are more openly and more consistently held, whether this is by the opinions of the creators or otherwise. Now, the interesting thing is that lately, within the last 20 years or so basically in around my lifetime, we've developed a very nihilistic behavioral norm that has become sort of the typical thing to do, and this is really easily reflected in a lot of our media. Now, whether this is Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman, or Mr. Robot, or a plethora of other shows that essentially tell you that you might think that the world is a beautiful, great place, but obviously it isn't as rosy as you'd like it to be. And there's all kinds of crazy examples. Whether it's the fact that BoJack Horseman is a disgruntled TV star who basically, because he has money and he doesn't really have any drive to do anything, is essentially fucked. He's got this weird issue with his inability to really find meaning or value in anything, and that is kind of his whole purpose, is trying to find some sort of third-party value that isn't what everybody typically wants you to believe, but it's also not the typical sort of out there idea of fuck everything, there's no meaning. It's kind of a weird middle ground that he's looking for, because he's very much out in the there is no meaning, there's no reason to do anything because I have money, I have power, and I have fame. And the whole message of that show is kind of that you can't really, think about it that way, because it deteriorates your mental health a lot of the time. Because these sorts of things are hard truths that a lot of people are not able to really fully grasp. And this is actually manifested really well in that show, in the kind of counterpoints that are BoJack and Mr. Peanut Butter. Now, Mr. Peanut Butter, if you guys are familiar with Wisecrack or Game Theory, or anybody who really delves into the sort of film analysis of those shows, they may have pointed out that Mr. Peanut Butter is what they would call an existentialist, and BoJack is much closer to a traditional, typical nihilist. What you'd see in the typical media as a nihilist is the idea that nothing matters, and therefore they are incredibly self-destructive, seeing no point to the world, to their lives, so therefore their only way to deal with it is destroying everything else. And that actually transitions beautifully into the next sort of example that I'm going to be looking at. When you think of Rick and Morty, it's very much a nihilist commentary on the world and a lot of the structures that exist. This is way more evident in season 1 and 2, whereas season 3, it's more of a kind of development of character thing that's going on, and that is a whole nother sort of ball game that we'll get into on another video. But the interesting thing for me is seeing the way that Rick, who is very much the traditional nihilist interpretation, sort of deals with things, and he deals with it in a fuck it, nothing matters kind of way, where life is completely meaningless, so therefore he has no problem killing other people, using other people for his own personal gains. And it's definitely started to feel like the evil Morty is really kind of the existentialist sort of interpretation, in that evil Morty has a purpose. He has, through his own interpretation and his experiences with Rick and other people, and just whatever has made him into what he is essentially, it's given him this driving purpose for control and power. Whether this manifests in him essentially taking the power away from Rick, especially Rick from C-137 universe, the Rick and Morty that we know. he is specifically looking to fuck him over for some reason, which will probably be explained later on, but the interesting thing is that he has this very clear, defined goal. So he's more of an existentialist, but he's definitely the more dark interpretation of an existentialist, which is really very typical for the world that Rick and Morty kind of emulates, which is a real world where instead of there being consequences and no way to escape said consequences, there is very much this kind of feeling of, as long as there's a way for me to get out of it or survive or just fuck everybody over and get away with it, I will. And I will find a way to do that, or I will just straight up murder someone to further my own personal gains for something very surface level and basic. And that is huge throughout Rick and Morty. That said, let's move on to our third kind of nihilist, which is really evident in stuff like Mr. Robot or very cynical shows. And now the really obvious thing about these particular shows is this idea of a societal critique, but from a perspective of someone who is almost not participating. He's not doing anything to change it. He's not doing anything to really say, this is who I am, this is what I want to be. And that is definitely where Elliot starts. Now, obviously, you see in the thoroughfare of season 1, and then in season 2 as he takes over and has the control of being fully Mr. Robot and dealing with everything that way, you kind of see him essentially adopt his own identity and become part of the universe. Whether or not he necessarily approaches things the same way that the previous Mr. Robot would have done is up for debate entirely, but the interesting thing is that the monologues that he has to himself talking about the state of the world, the state of reality, as though it has no meaning, there is no intrinsic morality, and that means that the rich, powerful, and destructive have completely taken advantage of that. They have done everything they can to undermine anybody who could be considered a person to take advantage of, and that is the reality. And the interesting commonality between all three of these different media is that the common instinct is that the world is a cruel, uncaring, and just unfettered, destruction-filled place. Whether that is destruction of the mind, destruction of the psyche, or destruction of other people. And the interesting thing for me is to see how that ends up playing out with other people. And you understand kind of from the perspective of the main character, who's generally a nihilist in these particular mediums, but it's also evident in interesting shows like, or not shows, but movie mediums like Deadpool, where you see his sort of lack of any real purpose outside of, fuck this one guy who messed with me at one point. So therefore, my motivation is, fuck this guy. There's nothing any more to it. It's very surface level, and it's very, this is my decided purpose, I don't really care what else. And part of that is the fact that Deadpool essentially went crazy with the amount of pain, suffering, and just general torment that he's had to go through in order to become himself. He's gone through so much shit that he's become self-aware, and he realizes that the world that he's living in is completely at the mercy of someone that he essentially, his existence is essentially at the mercy of the viewers, or in a sense, the writers and the producers, who are hoping to get an idea from the viewers of exactly what their thoughts are of the character and his approach. So if we don't like him and we don't enjoy his cynical interpretation of the world, then his life is fucked. So, in that same vein, he takes a very fuck it all, there's no reason for me to care, sort of who gives a shit sort of attitude. And that effectively really relates to a lot of people who are feeling like there is no place for them. There's a weird feeling in society these days where, you know, having all this information about the world, about events that happen, the fact that life is so precious in the fact that it is so easy to completely erase. And I say that especially in wake of a lot of the shootings that have been going on lately, especially in the US. There's been a lot of terrible shit going on lately, and it really doesn't even matter when you come see this video. That just seems to be a trend. But because of that, there's a lot of interesting shit that goes on, and the fact of the matter is people are slowly becoming very numb to the horrific events that happen, which can actually be related back to the way that Morty of Rick and Morty ends up getting really numb to the fucked up shit that happens in his world, and eventually just sort of embraces it and says, what, you know, why am I suffering? I might as well make the best of the situation. And that is essentially where we get both evil Morty and Morty from season 3, who is much more fuck it, bitches gonna die kind of devil may care attitude. And that definitely has affected him in a different way than it does Rick. While Rick essentially is battling his self-depression, Morty has essentially decided to deal with the crushing reality of a uncaring void through a violent reaction, which is really interesting to see the different ways that people sort of interpret their approach to a meaningless world and what exactly they're going to do. So it's very interesting to see the psychology of these different mediums. But the reason that these mediums are so popular is because there's a very obvious sociological sort of movement going on where we're very both meta in our own life and as well, which is really evident actually through stuff like YouTube and very user-to-user sort of interaction content, where the whole idea is being able to interact with the people and get a sense of you and me are talking, I'm talking to you, you're talking to me through the comments, and that whole feel of interaction. That whole attitude has really pushed a more awareness of things, which is what the meta comes from, and then the more readiness of news and information and the horrible atrocities that happen all the time has kind of given us a numbness to the dark, cruel nature of the world, and thereby has actually kind of contributed to the sort of diatribe and trends that you see in media. And this is actually why we see a lot of the nihilistic media and video and interesting stuff that comes up all the time, because our society is getting incredibly jaded about a lot of things, and that actually breeds a lot of the more negative stereotypical nihilism as opposed to the positive nihilism, which is what I personally try to embody, which is essentially the world might be a crazy, fucked up, insane place, but we can still try and take a positive out of it. We can still try and take the fact that crazy shit might be happening maybe in the US, maybe in Canada, maybe in the UK, maybe wherever, but in this singular moment, you and I are still alive, we are still able to enjoy everyday life, and we're able to be people. We don't actually have to be good, but we can try. There is definitely that option to be a good person, even if it's not necessarily required. Now, it's something that we should try and strive for, I personally think. Now, obviously, as a nihilist, I understand that your opinions may be completely different, and if they are, I would really appreciate you guys letting me know in the comments down below and sharing your feelings on this sort of stuff. Do you think that there's actually a trend of completely different style media? Or do you think that there is something definitely starting to come through in all sorts of different things, whether it's TV, film, writing, news, the coverage, whatever you want to talk about, let me know. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments down below. With that said, guys, thank you so much for watching. My name is Splice Knight. I've been standing here in a long squat. I am about to die. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. My name is Splice Knight. And if you guys want to follow me outside of the YouTubes, because I haven't posted in a while, so I apologize, but you guys can always keep up to date with me on my Twitter, my Facebook, and my Instagram. I'm posting a lot more on my Instagram now lately, so if you guys want to catch up on that sort of stuff, that's where you can do it. Also, I tweet all the time now, which is something I hadn't done for a while, but I've really gotten and jumped into it now. So if you guys want to tweet at me and interact with me directly, that is definitely the way to do it. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Oh, I'm so tired. I'm gonna go see you guys later, and yeah, peace. Splice out.